Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Let me, on behalf of the Center for Business and Public Policy at Georgetown University, let me extend a warm welcome to this first event in the Georgetown on the Hill series. I am Ferdinando Monte. I am an associate professor of strategy and economics at the McDonough School of Business, Georgetown University. I will moderate this panel with Brett Jensen, who's the McCrane-Shaker Chair in International Business, also at the McDonough School of Business. The schedule for today is pretty simple. We're going to start the event by having sort of a half an hour, 40 minutes chat among us. We will then give the microphone to you, the audience, for formal Q&A that will go until around 12. And then we will have some refreshments, and we encourage you to continue what we hope is going to be an engaging conversation throughout the event during that part of the morning with us. So that brings me, I guess, to the topic of today's panel. I think it's fair to say that the U.S., European Union, and Chinese trade relationships present some opportunities, but also some significant challenges in the next few years. The way these challenges can be resolved might vary. It could be a unilateral level, regional agreements, maybe a multilateral WTO-level agreements. But the way in which the path forward goes is going to significantly affect business and policy and the general economy. And so we're very lucky today to have such a distinguished panel of guests. I will let Brad introduce the panel and then kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Let me add my welcome. We appreciate you all coming out. We have a wonderful panel this morning. We'll lead off with Mark Bush, who is Landegger Professor of International Business and Diplomacy at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Then we'll turn to Ralph Assa, who is the Kuna Foundation Professor of International Trade at the University of Zurich, and also serves as the chief economist at the World Trade Organization. And then last to bring us home will be Chris Condon, who is the chief financial officer at Scout Motors, Inc., which is an independent subsidiary of the Volkswagen Group. And they are building off-road capable SUVs in South Carolina, and maybe Chris will tell us a little bit more about that. As Ferdinando mentioned, we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities in trade policy, focusing on the big three economies, the U.S., the E.U., and China. And Mark, let me turn to you first. From more of a U.S. perspective, what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years?
So the big question is whether the U.S., in terms of trade policy, ever goes back on the offense again. You're hearing a lot about defense. I'm so tired of hearing about tariffs. The U.S. has not simply pulled back behind protectionist walls, but it's in full retreat on the global stage at a time when this is really inopportune with respect to especially U.S. agriculture. It's hard to believe that we are where we are. And there are a couple of issues that are especially pressing and have been pent up for some time now. You're not hearing about them because they're not necessarily crucial to a couple of swing states that will decide the upcoming election. But nonetheless, there are a lot of constituents who are depending upon these getting resolved. And they do involve all three of the countries named, the EU as one, plus China, plus the United States. The one that I've been watching the longest is the U.S.-EU dispute, and much of the world is on the side of the U.S. should the U.S. ever go back on the offense again, over what's called endocrine disruptors. These are for plant protection, and the European Union has rolled out an endocrine disruptor categorization that defies WTO law. It is being questioned ad nauseum at the WTO before the SPS committee, and was again this past June. and refuses to do a proper risk assessment of what will be the ultimate barrier to U.S. agricultural exports, covering everything from sweet potatoes to wine. Case is called endocrine disruptors. USTR has prepped this one for many years. Nothing went to the WTO out of USTR under the Biden administration. Several cases did go to the WTO under his predecessor, but I'm not sure that that's going to be the uptick anytime soon. I'm not sure that Trump 2.0 will be terribly more inclined to go to the WTO than Biden was in his term. Aside from endocrine disruptors, there's another IP case that strikes me as being front and center. And you haven't heard anything about this, even though you're all going to consume the end result. And that is standard essential patents. Turns out that 5G depends on 100,000 standard essential patents. And we've got a global fight unfolding and no one's talking about it. Chinese courts have issued anti-injunction notices to standard essential patent holders like Qualcomm, insisting that for any country's firm that challenges, say, Huawei using a standard essential patent for 5G, they can only file in a Chinese court and must exhaust that Chinese court before proceeding elsewhere. Europe has filed at the WTO against this Chinese practice and in its stead has erected its brand new approach to standard essential patents under the EU Intellectual Property Office. Its response has been bureaucracy to China's legal system, and the US has now decided to weigh in as well, because 6G will depend on even more standard essential patents than 5G. And the US is thinking that it might create a brand new court to deal with this. So we've got a really interesting trade dilemma that has led to litigation at the WTO, and it involves rival bureaucracies and rival courts. We should be in this, we should be leading in this, and we're nowhere. Then there's AI. The European Union was first to issue its AI Act. The AI Act raises some very interesting questions about technical barriers to trade. One of them concerns conformity assessment. The European Union has categorized AI into three bundles: prohibited, high risk, and lower minimal risk. Lower minimal risk is AI in a game. Prohibited is stuff that gets you censored by the police. The high risk is pretty much everything else. And don't go reading these pages for a definition because you won't find one until you get to the annexes, and then they just list and list and list. So here's the issue. Are US exporters of AI allowed to self-certify high risk? There's one paragraph in the entire AI Act, largely put in the last draft because the European Parliament couldn't answer a question from the European Commission, saying it'd be nice one day if we signed a mutual recognition agreement with some countries so they could self-certify, potentially. Look for this to be a major trade blowout between the United States and the European Union. These are the kinds of things that get lost when all we do is talk about make-believe mythological tariffs. And that's exactly what we're engaged in. I get the swing state strategy. I get Pennsylvania. I get Wisconsin. I get Michigan. Let's get past it and get on to some of the stuff that really is going to count, and especially endocrine disruptors. There's not an agricultural constituent in the United States who doesn't have a vested interest in seeing this resolved. The final question that I'll speak about is just, where do we resolve, if not at the WTO? Will the US continue to do Section 301 type enforcement of its exporters' trade rights abroad? It's not just the US. Take a look at what Canada just did on electric vehicles from China. It pulled something called Section 53 of its Customs Act and went unilateral for the first time. Having grown up in Canada, I can tell you it is shocking for Canada to go unilateral. And the ultimate irony is that Canada is a smaller market for Chinese EVs than the Philippines. And the only company that's going to get hurt as a result of Canada's tariff is Tesla, which is why the Canadian government has privately gone to Tesla and said, we hear that you make your vehicles in the United States, ship those. The ultimate irony is that Canada is doing this for the US. And it's about the 2026 review of USMCA. This is a flagrant effort by Canada to convince the United States that it will play game in helping to close Fortress North America to Chinese inputs. That's it. And I find that to be highly ironic because USMCA is 35 years the descendant of the 1989 Canada-US bilateral, which I know way too much about because every course that I took in my senior year of a Canadian college was about that bilateral deal. And we were told at the time that the reason Canada needed that bilateral was to insulate Canadian exporters from American unilateralism. Isn't that amazing? 35 years on, Canada is practicing unilateralism to stay in the deal. If that doesn't give you a sense for where we are in US trade politics, nothing will. That is how low we've sunk. And it's a shame. So I see these three kind of going into silos with some of their club-related members and trying to figure things out. And that's not a recipe for predictability and stability all of the WTO. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Ralph, why don't you take a step back from the U.S. and give us a more global perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much for involving me, including me in this conversation, and also thank you very much to you to see so much interest in international trade. I wanted to give a bit. Is this okay? I can also. Is this better? Found a decentralized solution here. Perfect. let's just do that. So I wanted to give a bit more of a big picture answer to the questions that you two raised, and start by saying that I think the world at the moment faces a lot of challenges, but let me highlight three that I think are particularly important. So first, we need to maintain peace and security, and with that I also mean economic security. So think about the whole debate surrounding resilience. We need to build a sustainable economy, deal with climate change, and we also need to reduce poverty and inequality. And my take on the whole globalization crisis, globalization discussion, is that it's not so much that people have concluded now that international trade does not bring about any economic gains, but it's more that an increasing share of the population, an increasing share of politicians is of the view that trade is part of the problem when it comes to addressing these global challenges. So when it comes to building a more secure, a more sustainable, a more inclusive world. And this kind of big picture, I think you can also apply to the relationship between these three big economies that you were talking about, the US, the EU, and China. So let me just give you a few illustrative examples. So first challenge, we need to maintain peace and security. And let me, I'm the economist, so let me stay clear of the whole national security debate, but let's think about economic security, resilience. Of course, we had the COVID pandemic, and the COVID pandemic, I think, highlighted some of the vulnerabilities in global supply chains. We also had and still have the war in Ukraine, which of course raised fears of the potential for the weaponization of trade policy. And these experiences, I think, then led to increasing calls for home-shoring, near-shoring, friend-shoring, turning away from this idea that interdependence in international trade relations is what we should be looking for. Then if you think about sustainability, countries around the world are trying to find ways to deal with the climate crisis, but they're doing that in very different ways. In the European Union, it's more of a price-based approach. There's the European emissions trading system, which then is kind of extended internationally through a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The United States is taking more of a subsidies-based approach. Think of the Inflation Reduction Act here, for example. We also have regulatory approaches, and China is doing their thing. Just this morning I read again the installation of solar capacity in China. So you basically have a combination of these approaches, and there's a risk that they're going to clash, I would say, at the WTO or when it comes to trade more generally, because it's not obvious how they are interoperable. So there are calls by some of our members, including the United States, that we need to find ways to make these trade-related climate policies more interoperable. And then lastly, inclusiveness. I think that's kind of obvious from a United States perspective, where I'm getting at there. But let me maybe preface it by saying that international trade in the last 30 years has been an extremely powerful driver of inclusiveness in the sense that it has reduced between country inequality. So for the first time in recent history, the gap between low and middle income economies and high income economies has actually narrowed significantly due to trade-led growth in many East Asian economies, also Eastern and Central European economies, which has literally lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The incidence of extreme poverty in low and middle income countries fell from something like 40% to something like 10%. So just to say, trade has been a powerful driver of inclusiveness, but of course, what I was getting at is that trade has also caused some disruptions to local labor markets, including local labor markets in the United States, which then I think have also contributed to some of the skepticism towards international trade. So then, how do we resolve these problems? So where do we resolve these problems? I think the first thing that we need to do, and this is also, I suppose, my main message today, is that we first need to realize that international trade, if conducted rightly, is actually an important part of the solution to overcoming these challenges, and not necessarily an obstacle and part of the problem. So I think the first thing we need to do is change the narrative. And just to illustrate just a couple of quick points, think about economic security. I mean, yes, it's true that we saw disruptions in global supply chains at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, but it's also true that international trade was remarkably resilient, recovered within only 3 quarters of the first wave of lockdowns, and then provided all of us with vital goods that we needed. Think about personal protective equipment, think about all the home office equipment that you bought, think about vaccines, think about all sorts of medical devices. At the end of the day, they came to you through international trade. And if you just think about it, if you live in a risky world where you think there's a higher likelihood of supply shocks, it's just natural to say that well, what you need to be looking for is outside options, because you don't know where the supply shock is going to hit, and you also don't know who has the capacity to step in. So open multilateral trade is clearly an important part of the solution. And if I, just in closing, can talk briefly about sustainability. So I understand that most people associate trade with transport and transport with emissions, and therefore think that trade must be bad for the environment. You go to any supermarket here, you see buy local advertisements which seem to imply that buying local is always good for the environment. And there we argue that it's not that simple, because yes, there's transport emissions, and yes, we need to work towards reducing these transport emissions, but what's much more important are production emissions, and there's huge variation in production emissions across countries. So to the extent that you buy a good from a country that has lower production emissions, that actually can be a huge benefit to the environment. So at the end of the day, what this is all about, at the end of the day, what we need to do is we need to make sure that countries specialize in sectors in which they are relatively green at, and in order to, and when they do so, we can have significant environmental gains from trade. And in fact, we've done some quantifications that, where we make the point that trade is actually an important force multiplier for climate policy. So just to say that, I think it's important to understand that trade can be part of the solution. And maybe just one final word about the WTO. Of course, the WTO, just like international trade, faces all sorts of challenges. But one thing we should not forget is that it continues to be the backbone of the global economy, of international trade, rather. So more than 75% of world trade, despite the trade tensions between the United States and China, despite the proliferation of regional trade agreements, more than 75% of world trade is still conducted directly under WTO terms. So I think whatever solution we find to the problems that I've highlighted, we need to make sure that they do not come at the expense of the rules-based trading system, because, as I'm sure my colleague here will tell you, predictability is absolutely key for businesses, and predictability is exactly what a rules-based trading system gives you.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. Chris. So we've heard a lot about some of the challenges. Some of those are open in the public, some of those are not, but they seem to be equally, if not more important. You guys are launching a new product. Perhaps you'll tell us a little bit about that. How is business responding to, maybe your company, maybe the automotive in general, maybe business in general, responding to these dynamics and the uncertainty that comes with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic question. Yeah, I think if you think about automotive, which is my industry, and definitely a well-known one and a well-understood one, there's, I think, three things that kind of come to mind that define what we do. The first thing, in every sense of the word, automotive is global, right? Whether it's you're a customer here in the United States, you may be buying a vehicle from what you know is an American brand that's not even produced in the United States. Or you may be picking a foreign brand, a Nissan, a BMW, a Volkswagen, that is produced in the United States. And the reality is, for these automakers who you know are largely global players, they need, with such a CapEx-intensive business, to find that scale, to find those additional customers in order to justify the investments of, sure, an industry that has some massive profit pools, but ultimately not the largest and more robust of margins. Many automakers fight to go from obviously not making money to single-digit return on sales to maybe a more comfortable zone crossing into the double digits, right? And so in order to do that, the other side of global absolutely plays a part, which is the supply chain and the supplier base that we all work with in order to try and maximize the margin on any one vehicle so that we can pass a fair price to the customer that supports the volume that we need in order to produce vehicles at scale, right? So what we have is a global environment, Europe, China, Southeast Asia, United States, elsewhere in North America, with all sorts of suppliers that are supporting all the vehicles you see on the road today here in the United States. Our vehicle we're working on right now will have about 3,500 parts, and that could be 200 different suppliers from all sorts of, let's call it, origin nationalities, and then a whole other lens you could look at, which is, let's say, manufacturing nationalities. You could have foreign suppliers, just like foreign automakers, producing here in the United States. So it's a very complex landscape that automotive is actually quite comfortable living in. But it gets to the second thing I think about automotive, which is it's competitive, right? It's, especially here in the American automotive industry, we're looking for fair competition, which, to your point, we expect it to be predictive competition, right? There's a number of different ways you can measure success: who sells the most vehicles, who has the highest ROS, who makes the most profit. Different analysts care about different things, right? So we're always looking to try and please the right decision maker or the right investor on what that is, which creates a scorecard sort of mentality in what we do for a living, right? So we're looking into those sorts of things, and competitive is good when the rules of the road are understood. We understand what we're all competing with. What makes it problematic from a trade perspective is when those rules are not equal and not fair. And I think some of the references around the Chinese domestic auto industry is a great example of that. There's a 2021 White House report that confirms about $100 billion of subsidies that went into Chinese automotive, which is absolutely jump-started what's happened in that industry. So over in the Chinese automotive market, there are incumbents such as Volkswagen, there are new foreign entrants such as Tesla, and they are now competing with a new entrant, which is the Chinese domestic auto industry has woken up. And they have the ability to get the volume they need to scale faster due to, let's say, the government intervention to help offset their costs. So that's what's happening over there. But like you said, it's going to now expand. The fact that they're able to earn a higher margin, or they're able to earn higher volume to spread fixed costs across more vehicles, it's giving the money they need for global expansion, right? And we absolutely keep an eye on that. We see new entrants trying to move to the United States. You see factories built in Mexico. You see, let's say, trade agreements to come and bring vehicles as imports to Canada. We know the United States is going to happen at some point, and we need to be prepared for that, right? Which gets me a little bit to the third point, which is automotive is also regulated, right? And it's regulated in a number of different senses. Customer, let's say, safety and privacy are two that are things we as automakers absolutely have to deal with. Some things can be reacted to quickly. So when there was the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, I think is what it is, said, hey, automotive needs to have a relationship with a customer so they understand what data can be collected and what data cannot be collected and turned on and off like a switch. That takes some time to adapt to, like any regulation. Customer quality, if there's a new standard as what you expect a vehicle can do to protect the customer, you have to talk about R&D cycles and development. That takes a little bit longer, but it is predictable. And these things are largely put in place and saying you must be compliant by X. So everyone can react to that a little bit more accordingly. But there's other regulation when you talk about, let's say, trade, that, especially in an election cycle, you see a little bit of that right now. Something that's said for a good applause line or for, let's say, potential votes. Industry is not looking for ideas thrown out. We almost kind of, let's say, minimize their noise at what happens inside the company because we know they're going to come and go. We know trade will happen in much more structured forum, in legislation, with the involvement of trade associations, and that way we can understand what's happening and we can understand how it's going to affect us so that we can kind of move long term, right? IRA is a good example. It's something that absolutely is giving those who choose to manufacture in the United States and build great cars for American customers something that wasn't there before. But at the end of the day, what it does is give us, let's say, selective choice. Choose to invest versus not to invest. Choose to invest in the United States versus elsewhere. And I think that's the purpose of it. So we as a new entrant to automotive can absolutely react to that and make it part of our business case, make it part of our equity story, and ultimately be one of the key things to make us successful in the long term and not just be a flash in the pan that comes and goes, right? We want to be here to stay and be here to compete. So when there are things that are understood, well marked out, and aren't expected to flip a light switch on, a month at a time, we're able to use that for our planning and then ultimately get, let's say, what we expect to get as far as a margin on the products that we put in the market.
Right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. So I guess I'm going to abuse the fact that the microphone is on to ask the first question. Actually, before I do that, Mark, is there anything you would like to say in reaction to what I've said already? So let me ask. So you mentioned the U.S. MCA, and one question I wanted to ask is, what do you think are going to be the main sticking points in the renegotiation that starts in a couple of years, 1 year? And what do you think are going to be the repercussions of that negotiation on the relations that the U.S. has with China and with the European Union?
The word renegotiation is not the word that Canada or Mexico would prefer you use. The idea was that it was supposed to be a renewal, not a renegotiation, but no doubt it will become a little more renegotiation than renewal. The sticking points will largely depend on who wins in November. I have no doubt that Canadian softwood lumber will become one of the sticking points as it was on the eve of getting the deal done in the first place. Trump wanted to effect more change with respect to softwood. That was certainly one of the items. In terms of Harris, I'm sure that she will revisit the labor and environmental provisions, largely because she will, like so many others, mistake the deal for a labor or an environmental agreement, which it is not. And there's a reason why the original deal had labor and the environment as side letters. It's also something I would urge in reaction to Ralph's point. The WTO is at risk, in my view right now, of pandering a little too much to environmental and labor circumstances. It does so at its peril. It's a trade institution. It is not a labor or an environmental institution. And I worry about the waivers and peace clauses that are being demanded right now, especially by those who are climate proponents and wishing to see trade rules relaxed, if not outright suspended, for the sake of that effort. But the big issue in terms of renewal of USMCA will be whether either Trump or Harris feels that it is something of a second stage renegotiation such that all the new demands can be made. And I would wager that those demands will be expressed through both countries vis-a-vis China. In other words, how much are they shutting the door down to Chinese inputs? Some of you may not know this. Canadian steel and aluminum exporters right now use food traceability AI to demonstrate to US customs that there is no Chinese content of what they are shipping to the US. That is unfounded, unprecedented. And it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of what will likely be coming. So I would wager that the bigger concern in the eyes of the United States right now is Mexico. But the Canadians aren't far off, and you will see some of the standard issues, Class 7 milk with respect to Canada, some of the issues that have been long-standing since 1988. But you've got this one big issue, which is, will Canada and Mexico equally rise to the challenge of shutting down to Chinese content? And on the other hand, and I'll stop with this, let's not overestimate how important USMCA is to either Canada or Mexico. In as much as I know there is a view here in the United States that this is a leverage moment. What's interesting is that 80% of Mexico's exports to the United States are under WTO rules, not under USMCA rules, and that is because of the prohibitive rules of origin under USMCA. And since the Conservative Party in Canada will one day reclaim office, it is worth pointing out that their view is USMCA is NAFTA 0.5. That, in other words, it was a step back. I worked on USMCA's TBT chapter. I can tell you that it's pretty interesting. The SPS chapter, in my view, is the single best chapter of the USMCA. The rest of it's largely protectionist. And I'm not convinced that either Mexico or Canada is going to give a lot to get this thing renewed if that becomes the terms. So, one last thing. USMCA's TBT chapter will disintegrate if the WTO falls apart. And that's because USMCA uses incorporated WTO text, meaning the letter and the spirit of the law from the WTO is the basis for everything under the chapter. So it's really key to understand it's not picking or choosing. Ralph's point is exactly right. The WTO is the backbone, even when you look at the PTAs. The USMCA TBT chapter, technical barriers to trade, that's 93% of US exports. Uses incorporated text. It cannot function without the WTO.
Can I add to that? I cannot help, build on that last statement. I was saying before that for the world on average, more than 75% of world trade is still conducted directly under WTO terms. And what I mean is conducted under the most favored nation tariffs that countries have negotiated at the WTO. But what I would like to add, and this is just echoing, I think, what you just said, the remaining 25% is largely conducted under regional trade agreements, which in turn are subject to WTO disciplines. And I think you gave one example, but there's other examples. For example, the WTO stipulates that free trade agreements must be, free trade agreements, which means that there must, tariffs must be zero on substantially all trade. So there's all sorts of disciplines that come from the WTO on how to make these regional trade agreements work. And if I can maybe then, also add to one of the points that you made about, trade and environment and the WTO and perhaps there being too much emphasis on these new issues. I mean, the way I see it is that, the first thing we have to make sure is that these trade-related environmental policies don't, or let me put it differently, the first thing we have to make sure is that rules-based trade does not become the collateral damage of these trade-related environmental policies. And I think in order to do that, we somehow have to come to terms with these issues. Like, to what extent our members then want to go a step ahead and say, well, how can we use trade policy to be part of the solution? I think that's a separate question. But just to come to the recognition that trade, if conducted rightly, is actually an important part of the solution, and concluding from that, well, as important as it is to protect the environment, let's do it in a way that's actually consistent with the rules-based trading system, or make the rules-based trading system consistent. I think it's very important because also just to double down on one thing I said before, predictability is absolutely essential. And I often say that the WTO is a little bit similar to a central bank in the sense that, central bank is not just about managing inflation, but it's also about managing inflation expectations, because it's these expectations that make you write contracts, and it's these contracts that then well, actually lead to real inflation or not. And similarly for us, it's not just about trade costs. So it's not just about the tariffs that countries have agreed to, or the technical barriers to trade, or what have you. But it's also about the trade cost expectations. So it's also about the credibility of the system, because this is what makes you invest. And I mean, I'm sure as you can confirm, if firms don't know what the tariffs are going to be tomorrow, because the credibility of the system is at stake, that then leads to a lot of trade policy uncertainty. And we have a lot of evidence actually in the academic literature that that's hugely damaging to international trade. So even if tariffs don't change at all, just the fact that the predictability is undermined, but you also don't need a lot of academic literature for that. I mean, it's common sense, I suppose. Yeah. So just...
So let me follow up on those points. Chris, USMCA and uncertainty, in addition to softwood lumber, the North American automobile value chain was quite a focus of USMCA. In your industry, how are you looking at the potential, what was the right word? Not renegotiation, Mark?
Renewal.
Renewal. The renewal of USMCA.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as we are in a startup mode right now, we're trying to put together a vehicle that we can produce at scale, and then obviously that we can sell and service to customers. We're in daily and weekly meetings on every single one of those parts to say, who are we going to get it from? Is there good negotiation, good competition that's going to help, let's say, drive the cost down so that we can, bring the price down of the vehicle to the customer, right? So we're working with a framework, and we're using this as a way to kind of take decisions. Should it change in any sort of drastic way, we have to be prepared for that, rather than just be, all right, this happened, because a lot of, when it comes to, let's say, manufacturing or any kind of durable good that kind of ends up in a product like our own, there's an investment from the supplier side, right? So they're making a choice for viability to find customers like us, like other automakers. So it's not a, hey, you turn off this supplier, you turn this supplier on, because it'll take time to get other suppliers on board. We saw this during COVID with the semiconductor shortage, right? Wasn't just automotive, affected many different industries, but it wasn't just like, in 2 months there's more available, everyone can kind of resume manufacturing at the expectation of the consumer market, and or let's say internal sales forecasts. We all had to kind of react accordingly, because it's things that ultimately do take time. I think the one that is most notable for us definitely is going to come down with batteries and kind of the reference to China. China has, they're the ones refining, I would say, I believe the number is 70% of all lithium, 67% of all cobalt, and then also the manufacturing capacity, whether it's in China or whether it's in other markets throughout the world, they're at 90% at the moment. Now, the US government is putting IRA and, let's say, both consumer tax credits and manufacturing credits to try and jumpstart, let's say, a catch-up. So if that does kind of enter in, you find foreign battery producers right now trying to find a way to work the framework and the legal structure and the ownership structures so that they can tell someone like me who's producing a vehicle, yes, the batteries and the cells I will make are eligible for the credits that you can pass on to the customer. So that's a little bit of the dance right now within existing USMCA. When it gets renegotiated, revisited, changed in any sort of way, everyone who invests in this industry is going to have to react accordingly, right? And we're going to try and find a way to make the best deal out of it. That the benefit I have as a startup, we're in the process of building a factory in South Carolina. We're in the process of, let's call it, design or concept freeze. We have a little bit more flexibility to move from supplier A to supplier B. If you've already got an obligation and you're building the F-150 Lightning for Ford in Tennessee, and you've already got these relationships, it's a little harder to switch on a dime. So a little bit later to the market, follower strategy helps us here, but that's a right now thing. When we're here having this conversation 5-10 years from now, we'll be in the same situation as, let's say, incumbents are right now.
Thank you, Chris. So, does it work? Yeah. So, so there is a sense, I think, in which, this time is different in that one motivation for the subsidies and measures that the Chinese government is taking is perhaps to sustain particular industries. But the other one, I understand, by some accounts at least, is that the Chinese economy is slowing down, and there has been sort of a more or less conscious choice of sustaining the production side and the manufacturing side rather than the consumer side. And this leads to what you said before, among other things, which is subsidies to production almost across the board, especially among what they call the new threes, which is batteries, cars, and green technologies. So that seems different in that the scale of the reason for why the Chinese government is supporting the economy is much bigger. And on the other side, many economies have gone through already like a massive increase in Chinese import penetration in the early 2000s. And so the response already seems to be different. That we already know that many countries have started looking into anti-dumping probes for different products on different scale. Right, and so that's the sense in which it feels that it's going to be a little different. And I know sort of that making predictions is difficult, especially when it's about the future, like somebody said. But what are your thoughts? Is this really inevitable? And now that the appellate body is sort of frozen, what are the options for the firms and for the government to sort of work through the process?
You asking me?
Everyone, yeah.
This time is different. I would subscribe to that statement, but not just with respect to industrial policy, but really with respect to the whole narrative surrounding globalization. Because think back to the post-World War II economic architecture. The IMF and the World Bank are celebrating their 80th anniversary now. The GATT also is almost that old. The International Trade Organization was supposed to be, part of this architecture, and was then the GATT for a while, is now the WTO. The point I want to make is that the whole idea of the post-World War II economic architecture was that economic interdependence is a good thing, and not just for economic prosperity, but also more broadly for stable international relations. And you see that, for example, in European integration. Think about European integration. The whole idea was that Germany and France should trade more with each other, not despite the fact, but because they were geopolitical adversaries. And I'm not evaluating this in any way, whether that's good or bad. I'm just pointing this out, that now we are at a situation where the narrative has really changed 180 degrees. Now it's all about independence. It's all about as I said before, home shoring, friend shoring, and so on. So in that sense, really things have changed dramatically, and this has implications for international trade flows. We see. Well, first it has. So I think of it in terms of a cascade. So first, the narrative has changed, and the narrative has done something to trade policy outcomes, and these trade policy outcomes have done something to economic outcomes, and we see it. If you look at bilateral trade between China and the United States since the first wave of Trump tariffs, this has grown 30% more slowly than trade of China and the U.S. with third countries. So it's not that the trade itself has been shrinking necessarily, it's just that the trade shares have been moving away from this relationship quite significantly. What we've also done is we've done a study where we separate the world into two hypothetical geopolitical blocks based on voting behavior in the UN General Assembly, who tends to vote with China, who tends to vote with the United States. And what you see is the trade between these two blocks, quote unquote, is growing more slowly than trade within these blocks since the start of the war in Ukraine. So there's first signs of fragmentation along geopolitical lines. So I think we're really at a critical point now in the history of globalization where policymakers need to decide where we want to go. We don't see any deglobalization at the moment. Let me also make that clear. But I think now is really the time where we need to choose. So this time is really different. In terms of the WTO, if I can say briefly, I'd be the first to admit that the WTO is under pressure, that the WTO needs reform, both in terms of process as well as in terms of substance, so agreements. But I do also want to make clear that many things are still working very well. We have three functions. We negotiate trade agreements, or our members, I should say, not me as a member of the Secretariat. our members negotiate trade agreements, they oversee the implementation of trade agreements, and they settle disputes surrounding trade agreements. And yes, there's no Uruguay round anymore with sweeping agreements, but there are meaningful agreements coming out of this place regularly, both multilateral agreements as well as plurilateral agreements. And even on the dispute settlement front, yes, it's true that the appellate body at the moment doesn't work, but there's still a first stage in the dispute settlement process that's working. There's plurilateral alternatives to the dispute settlement to the appellate body that, for example, the EU and China have subscribed to. So there's still ways to get out of it. And one thing that I think is really important, and let me close with that, members are also increasingly emphasizing what they call the deliberative function of the WTO. When I came first, I thought it was the deliberative function because they want to deliver something, but it's about it's about deliberations. So just the fact that you talk, and it sounds well, maybe a bit weak at first, but when you see it happening, I think it's just so important, that you just exchange views on these trade-related environmental policies, on industrial policies, get a common understanding of what you're even trying to achieve, and you mentioned the TBT discussions. I think you can really take the tension out of a lot of these things before they even become formal disputes.
Yeah, on the appellate body, this is a long-standing problem. And especially in this town, you hear on a bipartisan basis that the concern with respect to the appellate body is that it is increasingly engaging in gap filling with respect to judicial activism, legislating from the bench. And ironically, the cases that are always rehearsed in this argument are trade remedies cases, anti-dump in particular. It is highly problematic that here we are since 2019, actually the last appellate body ruling was on Australia plain packaging in 2020, but the fact that we are now 4 years on and the US has still not offered an explanation of its concern about the appellate body is very disheartening. At first it was precedent, now it's national security. The precedent issue was a little odd in the sense that the WTO lacks a mechanism to ensure that there is no judicial activism. There could be something devised along these lines. In my podcast, I actually proposed one, relatively geeky, but nonetheless, sent it to Ralph and his friends. The issue of national security, the United States claims that, and this is true, its view has been that it's self-judging, non-justiciable. But we have 4 WTO cases thus far that say otherwise. And the closest the WTO has come to the US position is to say that it is partly self-judging. And it all boils down to 4 magical words in GATS and TRIPS on national security. But that horse is out the barn door. And how you get it back in is going to be very problematic. And ultimately, the incentive for the United States to get the appellate body back up and running is clear, because Europe will likely not comply with offensive litigation against it if the appellate body doesn't render the final word. We have pretty good evidence, empirically speaking, that the words of the appellate body carry a lot of weight with defendants that the United States sues. And make no mistake, the United States sues more countries than any other country except for the European Union. We are involved in 100% of WTO litigation, either as a complainant, a defendant, or a third party. We need the system to be working. And the one constituent here in the United States that needs it more than most, the appellate body that is US agriculture. We will not get compliance with endocrine disruptors if the appellate body doesn't get its last word in. We will not get compliance with MRLs or pollinators or any of the other agricultural measures that the EU is disingenuously throwing at us, lacking any science, unless the appellate body gets its final word. And DS 600, which is what the EU just lost to Malaysia, which involves deforestation, it's over palm oil, it would have been really helpful to get the appellate body to chime in on that case, upholding the panel's verdict against the EU, because that is the tip of the iceberg with respect to green protectionism coming from Brussels.
So I think at this point we want to stop being selfish and let the audience ask questions. I'm sure you have questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for all that. If we could, I guess, bring it, sorry, I'm just stand up. If we could bring it to, because I'm a graduate of the 2016 MBA program, and so if you could bring it back to, I guess, a business perspective, how would you advise not a large multinational that has, factories everywhere and can, to a certain extent, call the finance minister or trade minister and get them on the phone and complain about something they don't like? So talking like a small, mid-sized company, perhaps at one point relied on China for supplies, they can't anymore. So they're looking at nearshoring, friendshoring, but it's too expensive or just impractical. How do they navigate all this? And also assuming they're very DC dumb. So they don't understand all the things you just said. How do you advise a business like that to navigate all these issues you've described?
I kind of feel like we're in the middle of Parent is a large multinational, but we very much are operating in a little bit of the startup mentality right now, right? So, when we think about from a government relations standpoint, from economic, advising anything, none of this exists in the startup, right? That all gets to come later, right? So we very much, to keep it simple, right? We're looking at every single cost component and what the flexibility around it is, assuming those aren't things that are going to be at your convenience to actually levers to pull. So a lot of it is about having options, right? In the case of supply chain and figuring out who's going to produce the materials for your vehicle, it's having as many conversations as possible, let's say, to broaden that supply chain, if at all possible. Now, some things that we need for this vehicle are incredibly precise. There may only be 3 companies that do it, but we can't end up in situations where we're just stuck with one, especially in situations where they may be challenging from a trade perspective right now. In automotive, China is trying, not just batteries, they're trying to get in other places as well. There's kind of predatory opportunities to get in there, and then there's also let's say the classic business strategy of just get your foot in the door, take a loss leader contract with whoever says yes to you first, and then we'll kind of establish our feet, right? So we are watching all of these different things kind of unfold in real time, but I think keeping our options open to the best of our ability is what is possible for us. Now, even then, we are a large CapEx intensive company, right? $6-7 billion to get to the starting line, right? And your question may be referring to something a little bit smaller, which I believe my colleagues may be able to speak to a little bit better.
I won't be able to comment on or offer solutions for smaller businesses, but just an observation building on your point. What you're saying is that it's very expensive, or in other words, what you're saying is that there's a reason why sourcing patterns were the way they were, and changing them is expensive. And this is something that we also see in the data. So one interesting fact, just building on your question, is that I mentioned before that proportionately speaking, there's less and less trade between China and the United States. But you do see much more trade between China and Vietnam, and China and Mexico, and then also much more trade between the US and Mexico, and the US and Vietnam. Now, we can't really trace the products, but it looks like that part of the trade, is just taking a different route. We don't know that for sure, but that's how many people are interpreting it. And in a way, I think you could view this as just a consequence of the fact that it's actually very difficult to get out of some of these supply chains.
2 words: tariff exclusion. It's going to become the hottest product offered by the law firms in DC in the coming years. Tariff exclusion. But to your question, the beauty of being in DC and the fact that you even are aware that these are the questions that you should be asking is that the law firms and the consultancies trying to peddle their wares are posting a lot of stuff for free online. And it's not that difficult to find evidence of paths that you might be interested in taking. No one's going to say that filing for a tariff exclusion is going to be cheap. But ironically, we do have some empirical evidence that small and medium-sized businesses have been doing really well under tariff exclusions, and especially there isn't really a bigger success rate for larger firms, which presumably have in-house counsel to fill out the paperwork, than for small and medium-sized businesses. And my final point would be USTR loves small businesses. In fact, I can remember countless meetings where the question was always, how do we sell this with a story about a small business? And I think you may find that there's greater receptivity to your demands than you might otherwise think. It's really just a matter of getting some face time, and you can work through your house rep, you can work through a trade association. There are lots of outlets through which you can go, but this is the town in which you get maximal access, and I'd urge you to take advantage.
Yeah, thank you. The discussion has, from my point of view, been fabulous and very well informed. But it's difficult to see how a conversation of this sort can conclude without fully addressing the issue of geopolitics, which underlines much of the economic discussion that's taken place. And at the geopolitical level, I think it's fair to say that a substantial part of the American public, and probably the Chinese public, as well as the leadership of both countries and probably certain European countries, actually believe that in the law of the jungle, the bigger lion is better off than if the bigger lion was cooperating with all the monkeys and giraffes and everybody else. And in the law of the jungle, if you have 800 military bases and you control the dominant trade currency, the smaller predators get out of your way and the prey get out of your way when you want something done. So I think it would be useful to have some discussion of the geopolitical dimension of all of this, although it's not economic, it is driving much of the economic, and the underlying proposition that certain countries would be better off in autarky, or whatever term you want to use, than they would be in global cooperation, recognizing that global cooperation has motivated the international system for almost 100 years, and everybody went through the 1930s experience, blah, 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 but look at today's world and the geopolitical underpinnings. Thanks.
Yeah, a couple of reactions to that. First, it's not new. It never faded from attention. And the first thing to keep in mind is a recent Cato poll, which surveyed Americans, because they're proving to be hard to pin down on this question, and asked them, do you support tariffs? And a surprising number said yes. And then the key question came up, which is key for your question as well. At what price? And it turns out that almost a supermajority plus of Americans explained that they would not support tariffs if it added $10 to the price of a pair of jeans. The issue is always at what cost? And autarky, which is a big word, even in a geopolitically charged context, is fantastically costly. And if we want to just talk about critical industries, the Boston Consulting Group did a study a year ago of the semiconductor industry, and it modeled 4 scenarios on a spectrum of decoupling from China. And the answer to the 4 scenarios was anything that smacks of a quarter or more decoupling from China spells the end of the US semiconductor industry. Is that the benefit of autarky? Again, at what price? I worry about the language of autarky. I get this knee-jerk reaction to kind of push in that direction, and I'll start with this point. For the past 8 years, the reaction to those of us who are establishment types, apparently, who criticize the preoccupation with tariffs is, yeah, sure, they're economic losers, but they give us leverage, which seems to be your giraffe getting eaten by the lion story. I'll pose you the question I posed to some of the people on the panel before this meeting started. In the past 8 years, name me one example of US leverage from a tariff. One. I have yet to hear a single example of how the United States leveraged a tariff to get something that would not otherwise have been afforded to it. It's been 8 years. It's been 8 years of thick, deep, widespread tariffs, and have yet to see evidence of any kind offered by anyone from either party, from either administration over the past 8 years. So if it's out there, and if lions really do snack on giraffes, I don't see the blood trail yet. And I come back to this point, at what price?
I can maybe add a few words, and it's of course a very important question and also a difficult conversation. And let me maybe start by saying that I speak on my own behalf here and not on behalf of WTO members, of course, as always. But the first thing is just to reiterate that geopolitics are already shaping international trade flows, as I was saying before. I think I don't need to repeat that, but just to recognize that this is not a hypothetical discussion, but it's something that we actually see in trade flows. But two observations, and I recognize it's not a full answer to your question, but you yourself brought up the experience of the 1930s, and my sense would be that that wasn't a great experience. So that's our one experience with large-scale deglobalization. And I know it was a very complex period, and deglobalization, I don't want to pretend that deglobalization was the cause of all the difficulties of that time, but just to observe that that wasn't a particularly happy time, and in fact concluded with the establishment of an international economic order that was based on this idea of interdependence, and that has served us well, I would argue, for many decades. Now, one observation on interdependence versus independence. We talked before about the costs of moving, your supply chains, and if you think about it, I mean, if you start from the premise that there's a reason that trade flows are the way they are, because they are, driven by comparative advantage, international cost differences, and so on. Then if you try to become independent, say I'm engaged in some sort of policy that makes me independent of another country, it's tantamount to investing in your weaknesses, because in a way, there's a reason why you're importing something. So sometimes I wonder, and I really just wonder, so it's not like an implicit statement here, but whether we've maybe thrown the idea of interdependence under the bus too quickly, and could instead perhaps invest in our strength. And really try to make sure that there's a situation of interdependence that gives us leverage, rather than independence that gives us leverage. And I'm not claiming that this is necessarily the natural outcome of market forces. I'm also not claiming that there's perhaps not a problem of overconcentration. But sometimes I feel we've kind of thrown these, or we are at risk of throwing these lessons from history under the bus a bit too quickly.
Private sector view. Ferdinando, you kind of framed when you were talking about, say, the Chinese investment, what's the motivator behind why? Maybe it was to get caught up in an industry, but now it's just prolong it to give people jobs and, prop up, let's say, domestic economy. Sometimes there are elements to what governments do that are economic in nature, and just the point with if it's economic in nature, they're doing it for our industry, our jobs, our customers, whatever it ultimately is. The lesson is just, when the lion basically catches the car it's been chasing and it finally caught it, what is it going to do with it, right? It needs to be prepared to say, great, now that we've kind of created this elbow room, we need to be prepared to, let's say, thrive on our own in these sorts of situations. And we see that happen with, let's say, localization of manufacturing, and definitely helps in our industry. But to the other point of motivator, sometimes it is geopolitical. So at that point, it's from a private sector, we are just in a react mode to see, this is not being done for our benefit. It's not to do it to our harm. We just need to be prepared to see how that's going to affect us, and at the end of the day, affect the consumers that we're looking to service.
Thank you all. I think we've already run over time. That means the discussion was engaging, or also that we were not prepared. I'll let you choose. But I do encourage you to stay and meet our panelists over refreshments. Let me thank you all again for a great discussion, and let me thank the audience for great questions, and I'll see you there.